Welcome back to the Pacific Century, a Hoover Institution podcast on China, America, the Indo-Pacific, and the fate of the 21st century. I'm your host, Misha Auslin, and today I am very happy to be joined by two fellow Japanologists. For those of you who know my prior work, it may seem a little surprising that we haven't talked as much about Japan on the show, but arguably Japan is becoming even more important in the Indo-Pacific than it has been for the past several decades. And so I am particularly pleased to be joined by two old colleagues, Shihoko Goto and Yuki Tatsumi. Shihoko is the Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center here in Washington. Yuki Tatsumi is a Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the East Asia Program and Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center, also here in Washington. So, Yuki and Shihoko, welcome to the Pacific Century.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you guys here and great to talk about Japan. Some of the listeners may have heard the interview that I did with Noah Snyder, who is the Economist Bureau Chief in Tokyo, did that a few months ago. We've had some Japanese experts. We had the Japanese Defense Minister at the time, Kono Taro, on the show a few years ago. But really haven't spent nearly as much time talking about Japan. And so what I'd like to do today is actually talk about foreign policy, which is an area that both of you are experts in and longtime Japan watchers, educated in Japan, obviously travel regularly when you're allowed to in the new COVID era, but written extensively on Japan's foreign policy. And I think that we're in really a new era of Japanese foreign policy, and one that it behooves Washington policymakers to really pay a lot more attention to. So there's a lot of different things that we can talk about, but I think we have to start with the legacy of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Abe, who was in office his second time from 2012 to 2020, so an unprecedented 8-year period as Prime Minister, was to some a controversial figure, but really in some ways almost radically reformed Japanese foreign policy, or did he? And so let me start with you, Yuki. Can you talk about what you see as Abe's legacy in foreign affairs? What did he accomplish? What was most important? And what did he leave undone?
Thank you, Misha, for having me. And I'm really happy to talk about these issues with fellow Japanologists as well. So when it comes to former Prime Minister Abe, I would say the biggest legacy that he left for his successor to try to emulate, which incumbent Prime Minister Kishida is certainly doing, is to really put Japan at the very forefront of the I guess a discussion on what the new world order should look like. If you recall, Misha, when he first came back as a prime minister, and that he came back to Washington as the prime minister for the second time, he did the speech that at CSIS, where he talked about how Japan he's determined that he will keep Japan as a first-rate country, and what that means for him. And what that means for him was that Japan will be a defender of the commons, defender of the universal values, and also defender of the international liberal order, which vast majority of the world has been benefited from since 1945. And I think he really put out that new framework. It was very different from the what was called Yoshida Doctrine, which was prominent up until he laid out that key principles, which is economic development first, and then security policy takes more or less the back seat.
And that was from the 1950s.
That was 1950s, yes, from a former Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida.
Yes.
So I think biggest legacy that the Prime Minister Abe leaves for us is that kind of replace that almost like Japan-centric, right? If you think about the Yoshida Doctrine, it's very focused on Japan's development as a country. So if anything, I think Abe really moved the scale perspective of the Japanese foreign policy from one that was embodied in the Yoshida Doctrine, which was very focused on Japan's own development, Japan's own security, into more of a Japan in the more interconnected world and what kind of role Japan play in it and how he thought Japan should play in it. So I think that is really the biggest legacy.
So let me ask you at that point, because that's actually a really interesting sort of meta assessment, and one that I hadn't thought of, because so often we look at the narrow policy specifics, right? That's what DC does, is it often looks at the policy, like what specifically is done. So let me actually ask you that. What were some of the specifics that translated from that big global vision, grand vision, some might even, dare we call it, a grand strategy, into what the Japan of 2022, or let's say the 2020 Japan that he left to his successors? How was it different from 2012 when he came in? What were some of the specific, to you, the leading policies that had changed?
To me, I think the leading policy that had changed was the fact that Abe really actually came up with the before President Trump decided to call it on his own idea, that this concept of free and open Indo-Pacific. He was he was among the first leader in the world who talked about Pacific Ocean and Indian Ocean as one geostrategic space. Under his government, Japan really made the shift from I guess that Japan adjusted the way that it used its kind of a decades old foreign policy tools. For example, ODA. It was primarily focused
overseas development
assistance. It has been the tool for Japan to really promote more of an indigenous economic development in the recipient countries, and it was very more of a Good Samaritan based, needs based, as they call it, provision of the official development assistance. But I think under Abe, Japanese government usage of this particular scheme has become more strategic. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, we did start to see Japanese government providing more of a capacity building in the area of a maritime security, a maritime domain awareness, capacity building of a Coast Guard in the recipient countries, so end goal is still, stated end goal is still the same: help the country to help themselves. But then area in which Japan began to invest is increasingly more related to what we might call security realm, which was definitely a new trend unfolding under Abe, and the trend that, frankly, I would argue it still continues.
So I'm going to turn actually to Shihoko in a second to actually ask about today and where Prime Minister Kishida is. But before we go, let me just get your assessment on some of the more granular changes that he made, for example, to the right of collective self-defense, to arms joint development and export. Can you just, sort of briefly talk about some of those and how that was so different from the era, from the 50s, the post-war era onward?
Right. So I think this is there, as we go, as more granular it gets, more revelation it has that although Abe attempted to leave that legacy of reorienting Japan's foreign policy from more Japan-centric into Japan in the world-centric, more of a bigger context, but that's where I think where we might call rubber hits the road, where that's where I think his limitation is, because actual specific policy changes that he was able to accomplish under his 8 years, that is a long time as a Japanese prime minister, is really actually more of a linear progression of it's more linear, it's more step by step, and it's far more nuanced than some of us actually thought he might go. So for instance, collective self-defense that you mentioned, under his government, Japan did reinterpret Article 9 in the way that Japan is allowed to exercise that right of collective self-defense, which is in NATO's term, attack for one is attack for all, on the specific circumstances. And I believe it was a specific 4 circumstances, which was very different from what Abe set out to do, which is the wholesale revision or reinterpretation of Article 9.
And we should know that Article 9 is the so-called peace article in the peace constitution. Japan will not wage war, will not have a military and the like.
So from that perspective, Abe set out to reinterpret that Article 9 so that Japan can exercise right of collective self-defense anytime, anywhere. However, what he actually was able to accomplish was very directly linked to Japan's own national defense, and then in a very limited circumstances. So there's a gap already from what he articulated that he wanted to do versus what he was able to accomplish. And then I guess another issue that another area that I could point some progress is the Japan's export of defense equipment and defense technology. Prior to Abe, for all intentions and purpose, Japan had the total embargo on all of those technologies and systems. It was never really legally bind, but this restriction was so stringent under the export control legal framework that it was just essentially impossible to pull through any of those. Abe set out to revise that and set the new principle for Japan's ability to export defense technologies and defense systems. But in reality, because of the decades-old practice and old habits dies hard, Japan's own defense industry wasn't really ready for that prime time. So even after the revision, Japan really was only able to score minor successes. And many of them is really not in the major weapon system, but more in the terms of more of a Coast Guard equipment, or more of a, I guess, in the basically loaning the secondhand decades-old self-defense forces equipment, which is about to be retired, onto, let's say, countries in Southeast Asia for training and education purposes. So those are, again, the vision of Japan's defense industry become more of a global competitor versus, Japan has been able to accomplish so far.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, I was going to say the gap that you're mentioning here is actually very interesting. And I think there's two ways usually people look at Abe, either as sort of a dangerous nationalist and he was going to rip up the Constitution, or he's just praised to the skies as somebody who's completely overturned the old system. And so I think the vision that you gave in the beginning and then the caveats with it of what he was able to accomplish is actually quite interesting, which naturally raises the question of where are we today. So let me turn to Shihoko and ask about that, which is to say 8 years is a very long time, as Yuki noted, in terms of the Japanese political system. Abe had a long time to do things. He didn't accomplish everything, but it also would have probably been very easy to unwind it all. So where do you see Japan today, Shihoko, under Kishida? Can you talk a little bit about Kishida's foreign policy, what he's been pursuing, how much of it is related to what Abe was doing, or is it different?
Right. So I don't think we could stress enough the legacy of Abe on Japanese politics, especially in the foreign policy domain. And it's going to be very difficult for Kishida to emerge from the shadow of Abe and become a statesman in his own right. Of course, Kishida has the experience of being a foreign minister, but he has really yet to come out and define Japan in his own terms. And I think one of the challenges he will have is to take some of the legacies of Abe and carry them forward, and at the same time put his own stamp on the reality, especially in light of the rapidly evolving situation in the Indo-Pacific. And another challenge will also be to ensure that Japan's interests are reflected even as Japan takes on an ever-growing role as a unifier, a regional stabilizer, especially in Asia. So we've already seen, though, Kishida moving forward as a statesman in his own right. Most recently, we've seen him host Biden in Tokyo for the first in-person bilateral meeting, meeting that President Biden went to Japan for in person. At that meeting was also the Quad meeting as well in person. And the statements were strong. There was a lot of unity. And I think if there is any one message that came out of it, it is to say that at the bilateral level between the United States and Japan, at the Quad level, between the four countries, United States, Japan, India, and Australia, there is a unity and understanding of the precarious situation that the region finds itself, namely amid the growing threat of China, both from a security perspective and also from an economic perspective. And there is greater expectation for Japan to take on the mantle of not only as the definer of rules and values in the Indo-Pacific, not just on economic issues, but more broadly on the security front as well.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was also going to say, and one of the ways that he's been able to do that in his short time in office is to carry on some of what Abe has done and really reach out to Southeast Asia in particular. And he has made a concentrated effort to go to the region, to Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia too, which is the ASEAN chair this year.
So we're going to actually turn to Yuki to talk about the Quad in a second, but I wanted to ask you, it was interesting that you talked about Kishida's beginning of an emergence. What are some of the things, you mentioned Southeast Asia, would you put Taiwan, for example, in his making his mark? He seems to have gone much farther than what even Abe was willing to say on Taiwan in terms of making it part of almost, I would say, Japan's first line of defense at this point, given what he's talked about. Would you put that in the basket of him sort of putting his stamp on strategy and foreign policy?
Absolutely. It is interesting, though, that former Prime Minister Abe, even though he is ex officio, he really does continue to play quite a prominent role in Japanese politics, not just on the domestic front, but also in foreign affairs as well. And Abe has really made many comments about Taiwan. And I think that Kishida too is carrying that. And certainly we are seeing coordinated efforts collectively in support of Taiwan and preserving the status quo in cross-strait relations. The other point I do want to make, though, as Kishida being his own man, essentially, is that he is really trying to build a coalition for collective economic security and having a more, for lack of a better way of expressing it, collective economic defense mechanisms, so that we have.
So what does that mean? Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so it's really kind of deterrence. So if there is no there is no EU, there is no NATO in Asia, and it's highly unlikely that such kind of formal network is going to emerge. But what we are seeing is this flourishing of various networks and partnerships and alliances that are really geared towards trying to stave off China from essentially taking weaponizing, manipulating the fact that the world is economically integrated. And so that an attack on one economy will be seen as an attack on all economies, and that there is going to be repercussion, and that countries will actually step up and work collectively to thwart the effort of Chinese coercion.
Is this deriving at all from what China's been doing to Australia for the past couple of years?
Absolutely. Australia, South Korea, Japan with its rare earths a decade ago, these are all issues that are coming forward China dominates still in the rare earth market. We are seeing efforts by Japan, by Australia, as well as the United States to really wean themselves off from Chinese rare earths. It is making headway, but it is still, the Chinese still dominate that. So there are efforts to ensure that there are mechanisms to work collectively on that. What we are also seeing is the vulnerability too of greater economic integration outside of just the Chinese economic coercion. We saw that with COVID. We saw that with unexpected disruptions to the global supply chains, and we are seeing efforts to work more closely together, share data, share information, and perhaps have a better way of preempting or dealing with those unexpected crises as well.
So has anything concrete come out of that yet? Are there any concrete agreements? I mean, I know some during the end of the Trump period, we're talking about an economic Article 5 being the sort of collective self-defense article that's in treaties, so that, again, if one country were economically targeted by any country, then other countries would step in to help it, buy the goods that were now being, for example, boycotted. Has anything specific come out of this, or is it still just talk?
Well, I think what Japan plays a critical role in this. It has, of course, ensured that TPP did not die with the withdrawal of the United States, and that CPTPP actually not only came to the finish line, but actually is in the midst of expansion as well. The Kishida government's challenge, of course, is to ensure that there is an orderly way to deal with applications for membership to CPTPP at a time when both China as well as Taiwan are seeking accession. There is the challenge of meeting that, as well as South Korea and the United Kingdom seeking membership as well. Another specific issue that has come up is the White House's own economic initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that has just been released at the Tokyo meeting last month. Japan was instrumental in ensuring that IPEF membership extended beyond the obvious member countries and included Southeast Asian countries, as well as countries like India. And so we are seeing this common understanding of the risks to the global economy. We are coming to a greater understanding of the risks that China poses. The challenge and expectation for Kishida now is for Japan to keep it together, make sure that they're not just simply ideas, and that they are actually implemented with a specific roadmap.
So Yuki, Shihoko has been talking a lot. She's introduced this idea of the multilateralism in the region. Obviously, that's been going on for decades under, for example, ASEAN, the East Asian Summit, and the like. But there are some new initiatives and some things that either have been revived or are completely new and may or may not be game changers or somewhat of a game changer. The two that come to mind the most, in addition to the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that Shihoko mentioned, are the Quad and AUKUS. Obviously, Japan's a member of the Quad. It's not a member of AUKUS. But first of all, let's talk about your sense of the prospects for the Quad. And I'll pose the same question to you that I posed to Shihoko. Has the Quad really accomplished anything yet? Is it more of a talk shop? Does it have truly specific and achievable goals that are significant and material that it is aiming towards, and where is it going to go? And then after that, we'll talk about AUKUS.
Great question. Before I answer your question, I think listening to Shihoko's description of where Kishida is going and his attempt to be his own man, in her words, I read Prime Minister Kishida's speech, a Shangri-La Dialogue, very, very interesting. There, I think this is a speech, I think, looking back, I think he really started to put himself forward and he talked about five principle that he coined as a Kishida vision for peace. But if you look at his actual speech, he's obviously pushing back to some of the item that the Abe, now outside the government, has been pushing. So one thing that I thought was particularly interesting was where he talked about, even though so in the last several months, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, former Prime Minister Abe has been very vocal ex officio. He talked about, he wrote and talked about Japan's need to double the defense budget to 2% of GDP, make it the NATO equivalent. He even played the thought of maybe Japan should push US to engage in the talks about nuclear sharing. He also pushed Kishida government to really consider Japan acquiring what they call counterattack capability. So if you have those, Abe's out-ballooning those ideas in mind, Kishida does talk about all of those issues, but 2% of GDP completely dropped from this speech. He talked about increasing the defense budget over the next 5 years to the appropriate level. So he does strongly hint that Japan will go over their go over their traditional 1%, but 2% commitment that Abe was really pushing Kishida to articulate got dropped. And what was interesting was, even though he talks about, and this is a repeated theme that he talks to everybody in his leaders summit, President Biden, he talked about it, and certainly in this conference he talked about it. He did talk about fundamental reorientation and the strengthening of Japan's defense capability. However, he also says those enhancement of those capabilities will be done without changing the current Japan's status as a peace nation. It will be done within its own constitution, existing constitution, within international law. Japan under him will not seek the drastic reorientation of role sharing between United States with United States under the alliance. So those are all basically, he's rejecting everything that Abe pushed Kishida to consider.
Oh, that's interesting.
So even though he keeps talking, so that I thought was very interesting, and then how he upped the priority that he attaches to Japan's revitalized effort for nuclear disarmament, which is understandable for someone like him, who is from a Hiroshima prefecture, which did suffer atomic bomb. So I thought that Shangri-La speech was very, 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 very interesting.
That's good. I mean, that's I have not, since it just happened a few days ago, I actually haven't read it yet, and so you've certainly forced me to pull it up, and I'll read it as soon as possible.
Yeah, and then if you look into the granular of that speech, that's you can really see him balancing and basically inheriting some of the foreign policy initiative that Abe launched, such as free and open Indo-Pacific, but yet he does push back on some other agenda that Abe put out on the table. So I think I really read that speech as him really trying to step out of the role of former Abe, Prime Minister Abe is a former foreign minister, to Prime Minister Kishida himself.
So let me then bring you back though to Quad and ask you about your sense of where Quad is, whether it's actually achieving anything, and given what you've just said, how Kishida might push and pursue Quad.
So I think Quad is definitely one of those foreign policy initiatives that Kishida regards as inheritable. And the reason is that that framework can be more effective in the non-kinetic, non-security area than more of a hard defense cooperation. And I'm going to sparse that out a little bit. So the partnership and cooperative relations between those four countries, US, Japan, Australia, and India, on non-security issues, such as let's talk about supply chain resiliency. Let's talk about vaccine development, vaccine production and the distribution when the next pandemic happens. Let's talk about concerted effort on public health. Let's talk about the concerted effort on climate change. There are, I think, more more potentials in achieving something concrete, whether that may be a joint investment project in a certain, joint investment project in a certain pharmaceutical technology, joint investment, joint effort in creating the mega data for public health officials can tap into, things like that, as opposed to hard security issues. Because when it comes to that, India will remain as an outlier because of its geographic location, not just its geographic location, but its very complicated relationship with China, which India does share land border with. So there is a different type of relationship that Japan has with China, or US with China, or Australia with China. We're all having relationship with China across the vast ocean, but India does have China at their back door. So that brings inherently, I think, bring a qualitative difference and complexity into how India will always position itself. And just because of also India's foreign policy principle has always anchored in a multi-directional diplomacy. And we really see it coming out clear when India is not quite with Japan, Australia, and United States in its condemnation of Russian behavior in its Ukraine. So you can see when you keep pushing on hard security, you would immediately stumble onto those blocks. So I think I see Quad as more productive, more beneficial framework for all four countries if they pursue the other side of the ledger, which is more of an economic and safeguarding the advanced technologies and those areas.
So interestingly, there is another new grouping which focuses more on the security, as you're talking about Quad focusing, right?
AUKUS.
Quad focusing on the non-security side, although they do talk about, they talk about space and they talk about cyber and they've talked about some of the traditional security issues, but in general, I think you're right. But then there's AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US agreement, which began with an agreement to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, but in the latest AUKUS leader statement that came out in April, really expanded far beyond that to talk about hypersonics and counter hypersonics, talk about quantum computing, talk about space. And Japan's not part of that. So should Japan join AUKUS? Can Japan join AUKUS? Have you heard about any talk in Japan about interest in joining AUKUS? Would it make sense? How do you see AUKUS?
So I think for AUKUS, the debate of whether Japan should join AUKUS, to me, it's a parallel of should Japan join Five Eyes, which is the intelligence sharing
between the
framework
US and
that
its closest
anchors in
allies.
US and its closest allies, which Japan is not a part of. And there's always the side of the debate where Japan should be part of it, but then there's another side of the debate saying no, Japan doesn't necessarily have to be part of it, but still continue to contribute and benefit from it. The way I see AUKUS in Japan is because the AUKUS, whatever the other things they said, it began as the defense industrial conglomerate between US, UK, and Australia. And US, UK kind of pulling Australia ahead. In order to join that framework, and I think it would be helpful for Japan's defense industry to be able to join that framework, for example, in order for Japan to maintain its resilience in its indigenous defense industrial base. Steps that Japanese industry may have to take to be on par when it comes to industrial security and safeguarding some of the technical information and basically controlling access to those technologies and so forth. The step that Japanese defense industry has to take to get there to be on par with US, UK, Australia shareable level, maybe kind of a, I don't want to say bridge too far, because I think Japanese defense industry needs to be ambitious, but it doesn't happen night and day. I think it's more of a midterm project. And that I think at the end of the day, I do think there are areas where Japanese industry can contribute, but then oddly enough, all those niche technology that Japan actually leads any of those countries don't live in defense space.
Right.
They all live in civilian space. So I think it is really the key. What's really the key is Japan's industry as a whole can get there when it comes to safeguarding its technology, and no backdoor to Chinese side, Chinese company, and things, Chinese subsidiaries and things like that. And that, I think, is going to take a little bit of time to untangle. And at the end of the day, if Japan can get there, I do think there's a lot that Japan can offer. And I think it can be a mutually beneficial relationship. So I think it does make, at that point, I think it makes sense for Japan to join.
Interesting.
But not in the short term, because Japan has so many more hoops that it needs to jump through.
So we've actually spent a good deal of time talking about these multilateral approaches and multilateral initiatives and institutions, but Japan still has bilateral relations. And so, Shihoko, I'd like to turn to you to give an overview of those bilateral relations. There's a new leader. Obviously, Prime Minister Kishida himself is relatively new, but there's a brand new leader in South Korea. And he's from the Conservative Party. He has indicated more interest in working with Japan. How do you see the potential for Japan ROK relations going forward? There's the PRC, of course. There is Taiwan, and we've already talked a little bit about Taiwan, but not on a bilateral nature. And then finally, there's the US. So can you sort of go over some of these bilateral relationships and talk about where Japan is and where you see things going?
Right. Well, that's a lot of bilaterals to cover, but let me focus on a couple that you've raised. I think the first one, with the election of President Yoon and Japan's relations with South Korea, that is something that is of great interest to Washington for relations to be repaired. There is cautious optimism in Tokyo, but there is also, quite frankly, a lot of Korea fatigue as well. There is this kind of deja vu all over again sense, insofar as the Korean presidency comes in 5-year cycles. There is usually a high point at the beginning of a Korean administration, expectations for Seoul and Tokyo to work more closely together. And by the end of the 5 years, that has rapidly reached a low, and that has certainly been the case under President Moon Jae-in. The President Yoon, of course, is a relatively, not just a newcomer as a president, but as an elected as an elected politician as well. He is a prosecutor by training and by profession. And so he comes at it with a more pragmatic approach. And he is possibly more willing to listen to non-politicians, certainly take guidance from the foreign ministry. And there is a hope. We've already seen that Korea is sending a Japan-focused ambassador to represent Korea in Tokyo. And that's certainly a good sign on that front. But when you talk to Koreans and you look at the political landscape of Korea, it's not enough to simply talk about better relations at the top level, at the ministerial level, at the elected politicians level. It's going to be difficult to let go of that kind of hostility for a number of reasons. But one of the issues I hope will be resolved is for Korea to stave off from acting on seizing assets of Japanese companies based in Korea in compensation for wartime labor during Korean occupation in the early 20th century. But that is, of course, something that is not determined by the foreign ministry. That is up to the court system and the district courts in particular of Korea. So that will be very difficult to manage. Another issue, of course, on the Japanese side is for Japan to lift some of the export restrictions on the three critical minerals that are used for semiconductors that are exported to Korea. The lifting of that, the timing of that is going to be very difficult to navigate. But certainly lifting of those issues on both sides will be a concrete step where we could see tangible, not just détente, but a move forward to work more closely together. When it comes, I'm going to leave China to Yuki. And I'm going to actually turn to the issue of the United States, because that is going to be the biggest challenge for Tokyo moving forward, as much as it is to deal with the China threat. We have the midterm elections coming up in the United States. We have another presidential election coming up 2 years after that. The Japanese had been supportive of some of Trump's more strong position against China, and they had been worried about Biden actually backtracking from that. That has actually not happened, so that has been welcomed by Tokyo. But at the same time, now we find ourselves in a place where the US political scene is so polarized, and it is not easy to understand what the US policy towards China currently is and how it may evolve. So that is going to be a great concern for the Kishida administration as it tries to kind of uphold some of the very values that the United States itself espouses. And I just want to add one thing about Kishida himself. He's actually quite values driven. Yuki mentioned that he is from Hiroshima, and I think that really does play up to his political compass a great deal. And he's brought up this idea of new capitalism and kind of really dealing with the social dimension of the disruptions caused by economic dislocation caused by the pandemic, and a greater emphasis on profitability over kind of harmonization or investing in communities. And I think this is going to be something that he's going to continue to hold on to. He does see eye to eye with Biden on that. It will be something that he will want the United States to consider, and he does see himself as a champion of promoting new economic values and values that are needed, a third way, so to speak, for growth in an increasingly destabilized economy.
Interesting. Well, we'll certainly have to keep an eye on that. That's actually not something I've heard too many people talk about. So that's another facet in addition to what Yuki was mentioning in terms of his Shangri-La speech. So before we wrap up then, Yuki, do you want to give us your sense of where Japan and China are and where they may be going?
Well, Japan and China is indeed an interesting one. Before Russian invasion of Ukraine and Taiwan, so in this one, I think a Russian invasion of Ukraine really impacted the dynamics of it. And then also, not to mention Chinese increasing pressure on Taiwan and increasing aggressive behavior around Taiwan certainly does it too. But then Russian invasion aggravates it. I think before then, even under Prime Minister Abe, Japan was seeking to stabilize its relations with Beijing, so that it doesn't have to be friendly, but it's not, at least it's not openly hostile. And it can be competitive, but it's not overly so to the extent of alienating China. Japanese economy and Chinese economy are still very closely intertwined, and there comes Japan's challenge, especially if Japan's technological edge doesn't live in a defense space. How do you deal with that when rest of the economy is so much closely linked with China? So because of that economic reality, Japan under Abe was seeking ways to stabilize this relationship so that at least it could have a some kind of a constructive relationship, that stable relationship. Japan under Abe hosted the Japan-China-Korea summit. And it was during that summit, Yang Jiechi came to Japan and talked about back to normal when it comes to Japan and China, and at least start the process of it. But I think at this moment, dramatic improvement of Japan's relationship with China is very slim, giving China, not only Chinese increasingly aggressive behavior, East China Sea, Taiwan, but then also South China Sea, but then also Chinese position on the where China stands on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It really goes directly against what Prime Minister Kishida has been touting for, which is more of a value-based diplomacy, and put Japan as defender of those international value at the premium. So I don't see a rapid deterioration of Japan-China relations. And the only reason I say that is it's pretty cool already that there is not much more other than China tries something kinetic around Japanese waters that could drive the relationship further down.
Well, and that's something we haven't talked about. We save for the next time, which is the continued incursions into the Senkakus. It's a continuous pressure, and of course, as long as that's happening, you have the possibility of accident and miscalculation that could cause a kinetic encounter between Japan and China. But we'll save that for next time. But final question for both of you, just very briefly. So obviously, we're all Japanologists, and we've been in Washington a long time, and it's been a long time of folks in Washington as well as around the country focusing on China. Obviously, the nature of that relationship has changed. The tenor of the relationship has changed over the past about half decade or so. Do you have any belief that this will result in a renaissance for Japan amongst Americans or in Washington? The idea that here's a country, critical country, still the world's third largest economy, but that is an ally and that's not threatening, and so on and so forth? Or is that we're just, you're never going to get back to the days where Americans looked at Japan, or look, they looked at Japan both positively and negatively, but they were fascinated with Japan. Do you see any indications that Americans may turn back to be thinking about Japan because the hopes and dreams of the China relationship have really, in many ways, been swept away? So either of you, just a brief thought.
I think, if anything, rather than renaissance, I think a rediscovery of Japan, maybe.
Rediscovery, I like that.
Rediscovery, because if you look around, if you're in the States, we wouldn't even blink and think about going to have sushi. Everywhere you go, you now have sushi restaurant, whether that's authentically Japanese or not, totally beside the point. But
right.
The words like manga, anime, sushi, karaoke, Pokemon, I think more coming from the soft culture, but then so much of Japanese culture is much more integral part of American life, and especially life of American youth, that if you start recounting stuff that are Japanese that we have readily available around us, after this initial fascination of China phase, and you look around and you count something that's Japanese, you'll be surprised. There are so much more.
That's
So I
interesting.
would just call it as a rediscovery of
A
Japan.
rediscovery. Shihoko, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think expectations for Japan to be the regional stabilizer and a stabilizer of the world order is on the rise. And I think that quite frankly, Japan is currently the third largest economy, but by any estimate, that position is going to continue to slide. But that should not be something that decreases the value of Japan to step up to the plate and kind of deliver on the needs of cross-border issues. And right now, that is about providing political stability. I think what Abe has done is given Japan greater confidence in stepping into that role of playing that role that goes beyond its borders. No other country in Asia is doing that. Even China, even though it is this huge behemoth, it really does act solely in its self-interest. Japan has this greater global vision. It thinks about cross-border concerns. It wants to work on immediate issues like COVID. It does want to provide effective development assistance rather than some simply exploitive aid, right? So there is this expectation for Japan to do more. There is greater confidence in Japan. I think when it comes to soft power, Japan's kind of losing it compared to Korea right now. Japan does not have BTS. Japan, the whole cosmetic industry of Korea is really quite exceptional. But that said, I think there is this thing when we take polls about Japan, most countries have quite a favorable view of Japan. I do think the time for Tokyo to really leverage that has come.
Well, that's great. I appreciate the thoughts that you both have given on a whole range of issues, and it was just really. And we didn't talk domestic. We didn't talk domestic economy and issues and problems and opportunities. But certainly there is so much going on the foreign policy side that, quite frankly, a lot of people may not be thinking about. So this was really outstanding. I appreciate both of you taking time to join me. So again, Yuki Tatsumi of the Stimson Center and Shihoko Goto of the Wilson Center, thank you for joining me on the Pacific Century.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you've been listening to the Pacific Century. Misha Auslin, your host, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.